Well, it is 1 o'clock Central Time, so we'll go ahead and get started with the webinar for today. Appreciate everyone attending on behalf of the North Central Climate Collaborative. My name is Hans Schmitz. I'm with Purdue Extension in Posey County. We also have Laura Edwards as a panelist today, the South Dakota State University and South Dakota State climatologist, as well as our speakers. A couple of notes of logistics before we get started. You can feel free to enter notes to us in the chat if you would like. We also have the Q&A feature, and the Q&A feature would be for your questions for the presenters as we go along. And we will leave some time at the end to get those questions answered, and we do have 2 speakers today, so if there are burning questions, then as we change out, we can answer 1 or 2 of those. I'm going to start a poll right now, actually, and if you have the ability to fill out that poll, we'd appreciate it. I'll take down after a minute or 2. With us today as speakers first is Rick Stoll. He, as the slide says, is an extension specialist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and he has been integral in a program he's going to be sharing with us today, the Animal Agriculture in a Changing Climate program. So without further ado, I'll mute myself and let you take it away, Rick.
Well, thank you, Hans. And I am with the Nebraska Extension. I'm also associated with the Livestock and Poultry Environmental Learning Community. So if you hear me say LPLELC, that's what that refers to. And I'm going to be highlighting and providing some lessons learned from a project which actually has been wrapped up formally for a couple of years now, but there's still some follow-up programs that are being conducted here in Nebraska and other states relative to that. Hope to translate some of the lessons we learned from that official project into your bank account in terms of knowledge on this area. So without further ado, a little bit about the project itself. It was initiated through the Livestock and Poultry Environmental Learning Center. We are now calling ourselves a learning community instead of a center. Originally, we were one of the founding communities of practice within E-Extension. And with changes lately, we've decided to call ourselves by what we really are in practice, which is a community rather than a center. Nebraska here in Lincoln was the lead institution on this project. It was a NIFA-funded project initiated back in 2011 when the original CAP projects were coming out on climate. We were not a CAP project. We were we were a capacity building project, but not a formal CAP project. And we were focused on extension, one of the 2 extension-only grants that were funded at that time. And we had 5 partners, regional partners on the project. You can see them there in the graph. And our idea there was to not only get more institutions involved, more people involved, but be able to have some regional specialization and some focus to the extension programs and needs assessment and delivery of information to the types of operations and the needs that were relevant for those regions. And then University of Nebraska and the LPALC were in charge of coordinating efforts and having some overall cross-region programming efforts and major thrusts. So I'm not going to go into project in a lot of detail. Just again, we're a capacity building project, so you see the national facilitation up there of extension programming, and just highlight our first project objective was to equip extension personnel and stakeholders to assess stakeholder needs, and that's going to be relative to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So that'll come back a little later, both to deliver educational programs that target those needs. So if we just jump into our audience, and we spend a significant portion of the first year in the project really hammering through who was our target audience. And I've got the E's in this case highlighted or underlined. And that's not for electronic, like email or e-extension. It's more for this idea of were we really going to focus on those people in extension who had formal extension roles, or were we going to be broader and look at people in other organizations who also had extension type roles within their organization? And after a lot of discussion and back and forth, we decided that our target audience was going to be those in extension, but we were going to be very inclusive and invite others to participate. So the chart that's being shown now was basically assessing our audience after the first year, or about the end of the first year. And a lot of those people were personally invited. And so our target audience was pretty clear at that point. We had probably about 45% of the people involved were extension educators or extension agents at that point. And we got our N is pretty much not 100%, but pretty close, because those all were people that we directly invited to participate. By the time we finished went into the last year of the project, we had involved over 1,400 professionals in small E extension roles. And so those folks, if you look at that graph, that chart, it clearly shows that we had broadened out our audience, and extension agents or educators were still the primary audience we had reached, were reaching, but it wasn't as dominant as it was during that first year. So if you're wondering, that 1,400 professionals, in order to be in that pool and receive that survey, basically you had to participate in one of our more in-depth extension programming activities, attend a conference or major workshop, take the online course, serve on a regional working group, something like that. Just a little bit, I'm not going to go into the details, but some of the things that were involved in our extension programs, the why consider climate, that was kind of a tagline for, we had 2 blogs that were going on during the official project period. One was a regional blog and the other was a national blog. Our resources are all web-based resources, so we have a lot of videos, a lot of web publications and web pages, and then we had, I mentioned this online course, and it's an 8-module online course that was offered. Also mentioned professional development conferences and workshops, things like that. Every year of the project, we tried to offer multiple regional or national events, typically conferences. And so in 2015, this is a sampling of our major events that we had that year. And you'll notice that we engaged the National Association of County Agricultural Agents at their annual meeting. And in 2014 and 15, we had sponsored some activities at that event for the county educators and agents. in terms of overall project outcomes and impacts, I'd really encourage you to check out one or more of these Journal of Extension articles. That's where we tried to deliver our results, and you can dig deeper into that. Two things we were really looking at in terms of at the end of the project is we wanted to make sure we had increased these educators and agents' capabilities to deliver extension programming in this area, and also to increase their motivation to deliver that kind of content. In both cases, the capabilities and motivation were lower than what we would typically see, and that's because of the nature of the material and their comfort level with this type of content. We'll go into that a little bit more. But in most cases, we were able to increase capabilities and motivation pretty much across the board in terms of different skills. And I also encourage you, we have a planning guide for adapting to changing climate and some other things. Definitely encourage you to check those out in more detail. I'd like to move into audience engagement. At that time that this project was started, some of the other projects that were going on, including the corn cap, were doing social science surveys of farmers and other audiences. And so I'm going to use the corn cap's publication on their results as a template, not because it's any better or worse, but it's a good template, and we used it as a template. So their main findings from this social science survey is over on that lower right-hand box, and what they found is that farmers had pretty widely differing views and experiences when it came to their beliefs about climate change, their experiences with extreme weather, and their perceptions of risk for their own operations. Where they agreed, or they were similar, were confidence that they would be able to adapt through weather variability, and their interest in supporting efforts to help farmers adapt to increased weather variability. So what we did is we tried to ask some similar questions from our extension agents and educators as we were beginning our project, and then we added some other questions, but we basically learned that we are them, or our audience in terms of extension professionals is very similar in terms of their views and interest to the farmers, and that were the findings that were captured in some of these other projects. And so a lot of this makes sense when we talked with our audience. A large minority of them raised livestock themselves. If they didn't raise livestock, they may have had a couple hundred acres of crops that they ran. And the other thing that we kind of knew but we underappreciated going in was this fact that extension is built upon relationships, and those engagements that the extension professionals are doing locally and regionally really hinge on maintaining good relationships. And so it's especially important for us to address this issue of trust if we're going to engage them, because they were on the line in terms of maintaining trust and keeping trust with their stakeholders. Another thing we learned was climate change is a non-starter in terms of engaging audiences, at least our audiences. So wording is very important, and it gets to beliefs about climate change and perceptions of risk. There's a lot of avoidance of this in the livestock sector, simply because there's a lot of negative press, and they associated a lot of things with being blamed for problems. On the other hand, we found that there were certain topics that we could cover that were door openers. And so we knew we had to have a relevant program, and the more locally relevant, if we could make it relevant to a farm, that was the best. If we could make it relevant to a part of a state, that was good. And so we really tried to find places where we could start conversations. And so some door opening topics, these probably make sense to you, are weather. Everyone likes to talk about weather, including farmers. Managing risk and adapting to either change or extremes. These are things that farmers are doing every day, and so they're more than willing to talk about that if they are talking with a trusted person. Some things we did as a project early on is change our approach in several places. We changed our project name. Initially, we thought it was short and sweet, animal ag and climate change, and there was some baggage associated with that. A lot of people, when they saw that, they looked at that as an if-then. If animal agriculture exists, then there's going to be climate change, and that was not our intent. It was never intent to have that come across that way, but it did. And so we very subtly changed it to animal agriculture in a changing climate. We also changed our priorities. If you remember back to the initial objective, it included talking about mitigation and adaptation, and with a emphasis on mitigation and addressing adaptation. We flip-flopped that because of our audience, and we emphasized adaptation and addressed mitigation along the way. And that was, most of these projects, big projects, have some sort of changes that have to be made during the project period, and that was the main change that we had in our project, is that flip-flop in priorities. In terms of engagement, we really came to the conclusion you have to begin with asking questions like, what are you observing in your area? And that gets you into the door, gets you to the dining room table. And then at the end of the conversation, what we were finding is that oftentimes the audience will ask questions like, well, what can we do about climate change? And so we were getting to one of our goals, talking about climate change, but it was by a different route. Oops. We also thought about the look and feel. So our website, we had a special website at the time, and that has been rolled into the Livestock and Poultry Environmental Learning Communities website. But you can see focus doesn't look like climate change picture. It looks like something that's relevant on a farm, livestock farm. And the wording was made much more relevant to producers, and we included words like resiliency for animal producers and their partners. So that was really important, we were finding at that time, and something that producers were interested in. And so we tried to change that in our programs. Specifically talk about the online course. It was kind of a key part of our project, and in terms of basically form the skeleton conceptually for all our activities. So we start out talking trends in climate. Actually, we'd ask about weather, but quickly had folks think about trends in climate. Then immediately went to what are the impacts for your operation, and then talked about ways that folks are trying to adapt to these changes and impacts, what's working, what's not. At that point, we could start to talk about climate science and what is scientists looking at, what are they saying, talk about emissions of greenhouse gases, where are they coming from, and are there ways to reduce the emissions? And then that conversation leads into regulations and incentive programs. And then if you look over the bottom right, we put in a module about communicating science, because that was a big part of this whole project, is figuring out a way to communicate science in a way that our audience would be open to and would be effective with them. So a couple, starting to wind down, a couple other lessons we learned. Climate adaptation is not new. We were thinking that we could talk about topics like heat stress. If it's going to get warmer or more humid, that's going to affect heat stress in livestock. But the real situation is that farmers were already dealing with those impacts, and the impacts from faster rates of gain and higher yield in terms of milk or eggs or things like that was having a greater impact than warming of the climate. And so changing climate is a compounding concern, but it wasn't anything new or novel to them. It's part of the ongoing picture. Also, managing risk is they're already doing that. If you think about feed forage availability, that's still the main risk for livestock production, and that's been going on for 50, 500, 5,000 years, right? Raising livestock, you got to be able to feed them, and the climate's changing. That's going to affect feed forage availability. Weather extremes, we found is something that they're interested in, and but that's not new. They've always been looking at how to better manage weather extremes. And we mentioned resiliency, and that's a growing area of interest. On the mitigation side, my message is that we're still seeking practical solutions, and our toolbox is pretty limited. And so if we're going to engage producers, they want solutions. They don't just want to hear about the problem. So this chart over on the right, Galen might show a more current chart or talk in more detail, but there's two main colors there. The green, in terms of source of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, comes from the animals themselves, especially beef and dairy cattle. So they're producing methane in their rumen. As the cattle chew their cud and belch, that methane escapes the atmosphere. And so the question is, that's a naturally occurring source of greenhouse gases. What can we do about that? The other color, dominant color, is the red there, and that's methane that's released from manure, specifically a liquid manure that's anaerobically decomposing. And the main solution there would be a digester, and digesters are out there, but they're extremely capital intensive, expensive, and they also involve quite a bit of management. So these are the two big areas to deal with, and we have limited options. The other thing that's out there is this role of sustainability. I'm not going to go into that too much. Maybe Galen will address this, but this whole idea of sustainability is a pretty fluid, moving target. And so carbon footprint might be really important today, but maybe sustainability in 2 years will be much different looking. And so farmers are really wary of making a change that they might not be able to benefit from or might not have value for the public in a couple of years. Last lesson learned here is that this is a difficult area to do programming in. It's still largely problem-seeking solutions. And the educators, the folks who are doing this in the field, they have reputations at stake. So they want to be able to turn this from talking about producers being part of the problem to get to a point where the producers are part of a solution. At that point, the programming will really take off. But I don't think we're there yet. And so the other thing is climate is just a minor issue on most farms. And so there are other things that are going on that are equally or more important. And so ideally, we'll mix these kind of programs in with ongoing programs. So with that, I'm going to bring a close, make sure I give Galen some time, and just remind you that you can contact me or reach this information at Livestock and Poultry Environmental Learning Community's website. So with that, I'll stop sharing, and let Galen start sharing.
We do have one question that I'll ask Rick before I do the clicking to get Galen sharing rights. What about composting manure as an alternative to digesters for solid manure and using liquid manure for moisture content?
So great question, and we've gotten this question a fair amount. So composting is basically, just a scientific way to look at it, is basically aerobic digestion. So instead of having liquid manure that's digesting without air or without oxygen, in a composting system, you're basically decomposing with air and with oxygen. And so the methane production goes way down. The problem is that we generate nitrous oxide, N2O, which is an even more potent greenhouse gas during composting. So the science on nitrous oxide is not as well developed as methane, but we know it's going to be a trade-off. It probably will be a little better, but we don't know for sure, and it might not be any better at all.
Okay, thank you, Rick. At this point, Galen has control of the screen, and I'll just turn it right over to you if you'd like to introduce yourself, Dr. Erickson.
Sure. My name's Galen Erickson. I'm in the Department of Animal Science. I primarily focus on feedlot cattle, nutrition, and management. This is some work we've been trying to work on methane and beef cattle production. Multiple students involved and multiple faculty who are listed out there. So obviously this is a large effort and a team of people. So I'm going to kind of take off from where Rick left, and that is now focus entirely on enteric methane. Not a lot of national things, but what are some things to be thinking about that do have an impact on this? First off, enteric methane is a natural process. It's very difficult to change. And the reason why is it's anaerobic fermentation that's going on, and it's really serving a necessary role inside that rumen microbe and the ecology. So it's going to be difficult. We've been trying to evaluate the impacts of different diets and situations on microbiota in the rumen, and that would include many studies now. They're looking at the specific microorganisms, methanogens that are archaea that are producing methane. But I want to be clear with everybody to start with. It's been ever since ruminants evolved, my assumption is anyway, ever since ruminants evolved, methane production's been a common side byproduct, if you will, of fermentation. Somewhere around 5 to 15%, very dependent upon energy of the diet. Of the gross energy, though, is eructated as methane. A lot of people use the word, assume the methane comes out the back end of the animal, when in fact that's not true. It's coming out the front end. But it is a greenhouse gas, and it's one that we need to work on mitigating and understanding. And it's also an issue for consumers. And so therefore, regardless of the implications, we need to address it as an industry and work on solving it. Now, I would point out that here in the last 2 years, some atmospheric scientists have been working on methane, and it may not be as alarming as once thought. And I'm just going to leave it at that. And if there's questions, we can come back to it. But the potency is less, mostly because of half-life of it in the atmosphere. So that's good news. I think that maybe it's not quite as alarming as we thought it might be. We've been interested in developing strategies at the cow level, backgrounding or growing cattle and finishing cattle. Obviously, there's a host of research focused in the dairy cattle area in this as well. In general, when people study methane, they're going to put the cattle literally in a head box and monitor gas coming out from their head during breathing and eructation. We are going to talk a little bit today about chamber-based or methane barns, what we call ours. And then there's very extensive systems where you can monitor emissions using micrometeorological techniques. So Rick Stowell primarily him, helped us develop a couple of barns that we had that were mostly enclosed. I'll show you a few pictures, but we have clean air coming into the barn from the south side, fans that are exhaust for the barn on the north side. So obviously airflow is being pulled through the barn. There's ceiling fans for adequate mixing, and then there's sensors that we monitor methane and CO2 that are being measured in this ambient concentrations inside each of these barns. So this would be a pen, and this is a pen. So you could put 1 to 20 animals in these pens. That's how big the barns are. And then they're fed every day, literally inside the barn, literally with a garage door opener that we open for 5 minutes, deliver the feed, and close it back up again. So this was a picture of the barn. It was a sheep facility at one point. We renovated it. Here's those garage doors. Here's the air inlets above the garage door for clean air. Again, there's fans over here behind me. Here you can see on this wall are the fans that are drawing air through, which of course have been monitored for airflow. And then here is the sensor that is pulling air samples from this pen into our shed. There's a solenoid system set up to where we sample each barn at different times, as well as clean air, and then that's being run through a Lycor open path methane sensor. So this is a schematic of a 20-minute cycle, which is how we're monitoring in these barns. And I'm showing this, one, for some of the engineering interest, and two, to show the robustness. So we have a 2-minute cycle where it's clean air. Then it's monitoring in a pen, and you can see within roughly 30 seconds, it is up to concentration, measuring the concentration of methane in parts per million. Ambient concentration of air is obviously around 3. So this 25 to 30 parts per million methane is clearly easy to detect. So this 6-minute cycle would be average for the concentration. Then we switch to 6 minutes of open air, and then 6 minutes from the other barn, and then a 2-minute clean out again, and the process starts over. So every 20 minutes, this process is repeated for 24 hours, and usually for up to a 5-day period, to monitor a group of cattle that might be on one treatment versus another. So we have cattle that are in pens or in other situations being fed diets or under some management scheme we want to test. And we might rotate 4 pens through. So treatment 1 would go into chamber 1, treatment 2 would go into chamber 2, monitor for a week, then they'd go back to their pens, rep 2 from each treatment go in, rep 3, rep 4, etc. And treatments are rotated back and forth across chambers to prevent any bias of chambers. So I'm going to take you through a few things that we think influence methane that we used primarily the methane barn to evaluate. The first thing we want to do is make sure it was working, and one of the biggest drivers of methane production is how much calories and nutrients the cattle are eating. So we fed the same diet. It was a growing diet with alfalfa hay, modified distillers grains plus solubles, sorghum silage, and supplement for minerals, and basically allowed these backgrounding cattle to eat as much as they wanted, which is ad libitum, or we limit fed them, half of them, the other treatment, to 75% of ad libitum. So same diet in both cases, just one eating all they wanted and one eating 3/4 of that. And we did this across a 100-day period, grew these cattle from roughly 600 pounds to either 840 pounds or 780 pounds. Obviously, the limit fed cattle ate less because we imposed that, gained less because we imposed lower intakes, and then a feed efficiency or feed use efficiency calculation, which is common in beef production. While they're in the barn, these were the intakes of the 2 sets of cattle as we rotated through multiple pen replications. Methane was about 150 grams per day per head in the ad libitum fed cattle, about 126 grams per day in the limit fed cattle, which is what we would have expected. Per unit of dry matter intake, if you express it that way, this reduction of methane per day was entirely due to this reduced intake. And when you express it on either an intake or a gain basis, there's no difference. So here's my point. Limit feeding our cattle is not a strategy to reduce emissions, at least on a productivity basis, because productivity goes down. But it is a way to illustrate what's the impact of intake with diet being constant. This is our experiment where we reduced methane by about 19% with this 25% reduction intake. Similar concept done in Canada, where they looked at a reduced intake in a growing diet, reduced methane emissions by about 33%. But remember, this reduction is greater in their case. I want to point out the standard error of the mean is a bit of a test of how much variation there is under certain methods that are used. And our standard errors of the means, in other words, our variation using this barn, frankly, I'm quite proud of. And that's a good indication that Rick Stowell did a nice job helping us build this facility. Okay, now what about some, okay, that's all fine, but now what are we going to do? One of the strategies that's been proposed is to feed more lipids. Lipids have been shown to be toxic to certain bacteria. So if you feed them fat, it could wipe out some of these populations that are sensitive to oils, especially unsaturated fats. Obviously, then there's less fermentation that naturally occurs. So the recent NRC evaluated multiple studies, and Karen Boscheman also has evaluated this approach in their Canadian work of feeding oils and oil seeds. And they conclude that for about every 1 percentage unit increase in the diet as dietary fat should lead to about a 6% decrease in methane. And obviously, we're talking about relatively small inclusions going from, in forage-based diets, from 3 to 5%, and in feedlot diets going from 4 to maybe as high as 7%. So adding about 3 percentage units of supplemental fat. So what we did is we did a finishing study, fed a high moisture corn, dry rolled corn, blended diet as the grain source, 15% wet distillers grains plus solubles, a little bit of forage as a rough feed source. These diets would be very typical to finishing diets fed here in the state of Nebraska. But the only difference between these two diets is that 3 percentage units of the corn was replaced with 3 percentage units of corn oil added as a supplement onto the diet each day. So what happened is the corn oil reduced intake, didn't have any significant effect, but close to a significant effect of an increase in gain, but did make these cattle more efficient. But really the reason we were doing this was that's pretty well documented. The reason we were doing this with corn oil and adding an unsaturated fat was to test the effect on methane. So while the cattle were in the barn using those same pen chambers, intakes were statistically the same. You can see it's a little bit lower for the cattle fed oil for those 5 days each time each replication was in the barn. But methane was reduced. It was significant by about 20 grams, a little less, 27 grams per day, per head. And expressed per unit of intake was not quite significant, and expressed per unit of gain was significantly lower. So depending upon how you express methane, but for sure the absolute amount per head per day decreased. So first off, one of the key things to understand is how much cattle eat oftentimes dictates how much methane is produced. In general, forage-based diets produce more methane than grain-based diets. You got to be careful there because that's true per unit of energy that they consume. That's not quite true on a per day basis. And a per day basis, they're oftentimes quite similar. But if you reduce how much they eat, we can reduce methane. But again, you do give up productivity. Using corn oil did reduce methane production, and seems like that'd be a good option that would also, excuse me, improve productivity if it's an unsaturated fat and it's cost effective. Okay, for the second part of this, I guess I want to switch to biochar. everybody and their brother, so to speak, are talking about biochar. It's going to solve the world's problems. That's what I'm hearing anyway. Biochar, if you're not familiar with it, is generally produced from a process called uh, pyrolysis. Pyrolysis is basically burning a carbon organic matter, so to speak, in the absence of oxygen. Anyway, biochar you can start with different substrates that you're going to burn. So there's some variation when people talk about biochar, depending upon what you start with, that you're going to be producing that biochar. But there's been a lot of theories, particularly this researcher here in Asia, that's been proposing that this is going to be great to solve methane production. And it could do that by either absorbing the methane and not releasing it. It may alter these methanogens and the microbial population. I'm sorry, may alter the microbial population and how they produce different end products, which could influence methane or decrease methanogens. Okay, so a lot of ways this has been tested is with what we'd call in vitro systems. Literally, in vitro just means test tube, right? So in test tube experiments, in 2012 and 2018, using biochar decreased methane in the first one 11 to 17%, 10 to 13%, and then more recently 14 to 25%, with relatively small amounts of at least in this last study, 0 to 2% biochar is what was added to this incubation that was then sampled for methane production. So in vitro, in other words, in test tube, biochar appears to be quite effective. There's one study that has been done in vivo, which means now in the cattle, that has shown a response. And so I want to share that with you again. This was published in a little bit of an obscure place, but it does suggest that biochar made from rice husk, when fed to cattle, reduced methane by as much as 24%. I do want to point out that currently there is no federal FDA approval for feeding biochar to cattle. So it's difficult then to do this in the U.S. currently. I'm gonna talk about that briefly here. In Canada, there has been some work on feeding biochar to cattle and monitoring methane and actually showing not any impact. And in Canada, the system's a little different because they can get special approval to feed it essentially with a veterinary prescription. So in the U.S. here, we have done 2 studies, actually 3, sorry. One with head box, so where I'm going to show you where we put the cattle in a head box. And we did that with a small number of cattle, and then those cattle, once they were fed biochar, could not enter the food chain. And then we've done 2 studies since then, one in a pen situation with growing cattle, and then one in a pen situation with finishing cattle. And we got permission and food use authorization approval to feed it to cattle and then follow through on slaughter. So with funding from Nebraska Forest Service, as well as a USDA grant, and working with a specific supplier on biochar, and this is, you can see a quarter and what the biochar looked like that we were feeding. This was supplemented to the cattle in the supplement. This supplement that we would normally feed that has minerals and vitamins in it has no biochar. Obviously, when we add 0.8% of the diet is biochar, but put it all in the supplement, you can tell. And if you put in 3% biochar for the diet plus the mineral and put all that in the supplement, essentially it's biochar plus some minerals and vitamins. So it's easy to tell when you're feeding it. We did analyze if for biochar and these types of feed ingredients, you have to worry about any contaminants. So we've tested for all of these to ensure that there was no heavy metals and or dioxin and so on. And you can see that, you know, it's 85% carbon. The pH was alkaline at a pH of 8. In particle size, most of it was between 1 and 3 millimeters in particle size length. Here's a picture of the head boxes. We've used a head box design that actually our dairy nutritionist uses, Paul Kononov, and is essentially replicated from the head boxes used at the Meat Animal Research Center. So there's a lot of head boxes that have been used for this type of work, where essentially air in and air out is monitored for CO2 and methane, and so you can, from airflow, measure how much methane is being expelled by these cattle. Okay, so in the first study we did, this is in a growing diet, so a high forage-based diet. Just want to focus on this line here, and then also grams per intake of energy, okay? So we fed 0.8 or 3% biochar in the diet. If you look at methane, and you can see what the intakes were for those cattle, we also measured how much energy is in those diets. And so we could quantify digestible energy intake. That's what DEI is in mega cows. So on a per day basis, grams per day of methane per head was about 109, 97, and 101. Okay, that goes the right direction, but it was not technically significant. The quadratic p-value was a p-value of 0.14, so it's getting close to being, probably a repeatable observation. And then if we just look at combining the 0.8 or 3% biochar, so just saying, yes, they got biochar, or no, they didn't. So you compare these two to this treatment, increases your power, so your statistical power some, and improves the p-value slightly, just being open with you on why that's done and why we looked at just whether they were fed biochar or not. And it's hard because your replications are low in these trials where you're using head boxes. But on a per unit of grams of methane per unit or per megacal of digestible energy intake, now we see a quadratic reduction in methane and likely a response to feeding biochar versus not, where it reduced methane in these head boxes. We did the same exact study, but now with finishing diets on the same cattle, so that because once they were trained and we weren't going to be able to use them for any food use. And I guess I want to point out that here we saw a reduction, but it was not significant statistically, and that's because of low replications, I think. Now we've carried this on to the pen level, which I'll show you. But about a 20-gram decrease in methane, which if it's repeatable and statistically sound, that would be significant. Not as much on the per unit of energy intake because intakes decreased at this 3% level. Okay, then to wrap up methane, the only thing I'm going to show today, which is just in the midst of being analyzed, is we've done some biochar feeding in our pen setting and then evaluating that in the methane barn. These are the cattle that were granted special food use authorization. And so we were able to slaughter them and actually get performance data on a large number. It was roughly 128 head of cattle. Anyway, if you look at methane for cattle fed biochar, about 165 grams a day, about 169 in the control, which will likely be insignificant. Again, we're just doing the statistics now. And per unit of intake, my guess is that will not be significant, but want to wait and see. So it's not clear cut that biochar is going to solve this issue like everybody may propose currently. We are testing now some different ones as well as particle size, and the Canadian work in combination with ours, I think, will be a much more complete answer on what's the opportunity for feeding biochar. Last thing I want to mention, which I won't show any data on, is that us here at Nebraska, as well as other places, are using micrometeorological techniques and extensive production systems, so like out on pasture, to monitor greenhouse gas emissions from different grazing systems, different diets throughout the season, and so on. And it's quite challenging work to do. We are measuring CO2, methane, and N2O in our systems. We're comparing two cow systems, as well as the calves that are produced from that system during a forage based backgrounding system and a finishing system. So we'll have a very good picture of greenhouse gas emissions from a complete beef production system. That is funded by the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, funding that the University of Nebraska received. We're also a member of a large, I think it's 18 sites, long-term agroecosystem research network, LTAR, and we're monitoring a few different treatments as well as some grazing systems using micrometeorological techniques in those systems. So with that, I tried to stick to the 20 minutes, but I'd be happy to take any questions, Hans, if there are any, or turn it back to you, or however you want to do this.
Well, sure. We did have a question or two come in. I'm going to go ahead and open the next poll and turn it over to Laura Edwards for asking the questions.
Sure. Yep. We did have a question for you, Galen, going back a little ways in your presentation. Is corn oil approved by the FDA for feed use?
Yeah, that's a excuse me. That's a good question. Yeah, corn oil as a feed ingredient because it originated from the corn. Assuming it has not had any contamination, or in other words, additives put with it, corn oil by itself is an approved feed ingredient. There are many oils, oil seeds that are extracted and approved as feed use. Yes.
All right, thanks. Well, that's the only question I see right now, Hans, unless you have something else like that directly to you.
Okay, so do please enter any questions in the Q&A or the chat, fill out the poll, and I'll let the poll ride while I ask one question for Galen here. How do we create the biochar that we are using in the cattle diets?
Yeah, ours was a wood residue. Okay. The concept we've been thinking about is that we have a few invasive species here in the Great Plains of Nebraska, one eastern red cedar. And so there's a lot of interest in if we can clean up eastern red cedar as a invasive species, and then what do you do with eastern red cedar, right? Well, could you make it into a biochar? And so many have had that concept and idea here in Nebraska. Ours was a pine residue, or pine's feedstock going into the biochar that was made by the High Plains biochar group. And so that's the one we tested. There has been other ones that have been used as feedstock, both in the Asian work as well as the Canadian work. And we don't know, I think the Canadians did a lot of in vitro assessments of different feedstocks of biochar, and they did see some differences, but I can't explain why or rhyme or reason. I'm not saying that's not true. I'm saying I don't know if we can predict that this feedstock's automatically better than this feedstock, and what are those characteristics that make that better. I'm worried because it'd be a lot easier for everybody to just say biochar works or biochar doesn't work. But when you start saying, well, biochar from this process works, but it doesn't from this one, it creates a whole lot of risk and challenge and confusion. So I guess my conclusion is this. Everybody's talking about biochar for all kinds of uses. This is obviously applied to feeding it to the cattle. And I would say the verdict is certainly undecided by me currently on whether this works or not. I'd like to see a lot more in vivo evidence that it's effective and works.
Great, thanks. And we do have another question in the Q&A from Galen. Are there other feed additives that look promising for reducing methane emissions from cattle?
Yes, there are. There are some and been worked on. Everybody's probably heard of lemongrass, maybe, if you're in this space. There was a study done outside the U.S. and then a food company picked up on that and I think is now retracting some of those things. I'm not convinced lemongrass is one of them. There is a compound called 3-NOP, which is being worked on to be approved. It does appear to be quite effective. So there are some candidate feed additives that will likely have to go through the full FDA approval process to be fed to cattle for food use. But there are some that will be very effective. I've got to share with you that I'm just from an environmental perspective, I'm not overly alarmed about methane and that we will fix the enteric methane challenges, both from the standpoint that I don't think it's as potency as great as we've once thought, and two, the beef industry and dairy industries, I think will figure out ways through diet and management to mitigate it. I'm more worried about reactive nitrogen and things that are not easily controlled or fixed right now. But that does not mean it doesn't deserve a lot of work to get to that point where it's not a concern anymore, which is why we're doing some of this work. But yeah, there are other feed additives coming that are going to be effective.
Great. We have another question here, maybe for both you and or Rick. Are there any plans to take this topic to on-farm research? That's the extension plus research plus local producer.
Yeah, a lot of, well, I'll comment and then Rick can, if he's still listening, I might have put him to sleep. But yes, a lot of the work we do, first off, the facility that we use, especially that we want to get to and show that it works, is quite applied and kind of basically built and operated and constructed to mimic commercial situations that producers would have. But with that said, through SARE grants and other mechanisms, we do some on-farm research with those, especially with early adopters and influencers, and then allows extension to host field days. So that's a model we commonly employ here in Nebraska. I think that model's one that fits across many regions, especially universities, land-grant universities with active extension programs.
And I'll just chime in that there's a lot of interest in doing field research, specifically with working with private producers, commercial producers. Some innovative ways of doing that are being looked into with on the crop side, with plots and little competitions where people can try things out on their own farm and share data. That's a little bit more challenging, or quite a bit more challenging to do in livestock, in the livestock industry. So a lot of interest in it, not a whole lot being done at the moment.
I agree with you, Rick. It is a whole different approach with livestock involved. And so we do some I call on feedlot research, but really you got to have control over what the treatments are and being implemented. And because if it's a dietary treatment, it's applied every single day, right, when you feed them. And so there's a lot of management to be able to pull off on-farm research with cattle involved.
All right, great. Hans had to drop off. I think you can still hear us, but we lost some video. If there are any other questions, we've got about 2 minutes left to go in the Q&A, and then I can see them and the presenters can see them as well. Or Rick or Galen, if you have anything else last to add here in the last couple of minutes.
Nope.
Appreciate having a chance to converse with you folks.
Yeah, happy to help if we ever can, or if there's something that fits for our expertise, be happy to help anybody.
Yeah, and I'll just add too that these webinars are recorded with NC3, with the North Central Climate Collaborative, and we'll post it on our website in about a week. That's northcentralclimate.org. There's a webinar.
Laura, there was a question. Do you want me to answer that one? It was on why is the meat not considered for human consumption? I assume that's a reference to the biochar study I mentioned.
Yeah, go ahead and answer that.
So to be crystal clear, for food safety concerns, anything that is fed to animals undergoes a rigorous set of tests to ensure that there's no possibility of any harmful residue or risk to humans when that meat then is consumed. So if you're not aware of it, there's very strict requirements on what's allowed to be fed to cattle outside of natural plants and feed ingredients. So as soon as you have something that's quote unquote manufactured or unnatural. I don't want to use that word, but I think you know what I mean, between a natural plant feed ingredient versus something like a feed additive. Then it has to undergo either formal FDA approval uh, or can undergo an FDA process to be granted GRAS status. GRAS meaning generally recognized as safe. But even for GRAS status, there's rigorous testing to make sure that it's not harmful to either the animal or have any residue left over or possible in humans. So when we got food use authorization, it was so that those cattle that we fed biochar could enter the human food chain for human food consumption, but that doesn't. There was a limited number of cattle we could do that with, and that again, that was a one-time deal. So there needs to be for biochar some greater interest in getting that approved for food use. But I would say before we worry about that, you want to document whether it's effective and has a place for any mitigation on methane or other positive benefits.
Is that the question from Kevin? I think there's a question from Kevin in the chat.
I'm sorry, no, I was on the Q&A, and that was from Glenn.
Sorry, Kevin, I don't see your question, so if you want to put it in the Q&A, I think we can see it better.
There was a question about NRCS and the animal manure, animal waste management modeling software.
Yeah, go ahead. If you have a response to that, I don't see that. So.
Yes, and in fact, some of the equations used for predicting nutrient excretion and so on, I've been more involved with. In other words, what we feed cattle is very much dictating what the cattle excrete, and that's across all species. And so I've been very involved with that process, which then ASABE standards, as well as then the NRCS software, I think, have adopted those approaches. Rick, you may know that better than me.
Yeah, that's not I know they're looking to update those, but they have current equations in place, and a colleague, Rick Cal, should be the expert on that.
Yeah, I apologize. There are a fair number of questions in the chat, and so I think we've answered a fair number of them. So I think, Laura, it's up to you how you want to handle that. I'm happy to.
Yeah, we're at time now, and I think if you want to continue answering questions, you can, but I know people will drop off. So if there are any that you see that haven't been addressed yet, you can ask those.
Well, there's a question about grazing and managed pastures versus harvested feeds. That's a complicated issue there because you have grazing has some natural challenges. Harvested feeds have some natural challenges, at least in this realm of greenhouse gas emissions, fuel use, productivity, energy capture from the feed itself, change in quality across time with grade systems. So I would say it would be impossible to say grazing is always better than harvested feeds or harvested feeds are always better than grazing. There are situations when both have benefits, and there's certain areas that are only going to be allowed for grazing. So, for example, one of my concerns is people have offered a solution as one way to cut methane concerns is to eat less beef. Well, that's obviously not an option that's in my vocabulary, but it also really, I think, it illustrates a complete lack of understanding of how food production works and how land use works today, and likely will have to work in the future. Roughly, based on USDA land use allocations, roughly 35% of the land is in rangelands and pasture lands. not all of that, but a vast majority of that will only be usable, so to speak, at least for human food production, usable only by grazing ruminants. So that doesn't have to be beef cattle. That could be dairy, which is unlikely in extensive systems. That could be sheep, could be goats, so it could be other ruminants. But if you say that, well, we should just convert our land use to plant to crops that can be directly consumed by humans, or to raise corn and beans for non-ruminant pigs and poultry production, I think is a little shows a lack of understanding of land use and possibilities that we have today. I would argue it's better for us to harvest sunlight on those grazing lands, and one way to harvest that sunlight for human food use is through grazing ruminants. I don't know if that answers that question, but there are downsides to grazing over harvested feeds as well, and that is quality is difficult to control. I don't know, Laura, there are many other things that we haven't really discussed, or I don't fully understand the questions, but I think I'll stop talking there.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, feel free, anyone, to reach out to Galen and Rick after the talk, and we can put you in contact with them too if you didn't capture their emails. So we'll close it out here. Thank you, Galen and Rick, for the presentation today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.